Just as I was coming over here, I just had this strange sensation walking in. I saw these two physicists talking in a room, one guy standing up, and he's really animated. And they're so intently speaking to each other, and I haven't got a clue what they're talking about. But it reminded me that every time I've come over here since I was a child, that's what I see. I see this intensity and this vigor and sort of a real purpose. But it's always been strange to me. I'm not a scientist, and I understand the emotional quality of what it is, but I've never understood what the hell they're talking about. My name is Gail Block. I'm the daughter of B. and Martin Block. I have a brother, Stephen Block, who is also a scientist. And I have two kids, Alex and Natalie Touboul. And I've been coming here to Aspen since the early 60s. I think the first summer we were at the Physics Center was the summer of 1963. So it must have existed for only 1 year prior to our being here. And the most vivid memory I had, because I was 10 years old, was we were put up in this little house, tiny little house, I don't know, maybe 1,000 square feet. But it was so exciting because we were up, it was the highest point at the time on Aspen Mountain. It was called the Anderman House, and we had to take a tram to it. And when you're a 10-year-old, there is nothing more thrilling. I'd never used this form of transportation, and I grew up skiing. I'd been skiing since I was 4 and 5, and I'd been on a rope tow, and I'd been on a ski lift, a chair lift. In fact, here in Aspen, the year before we came, for the summer, it was the first winter we were ever here. My dad had just, I think, moved to Northwestern, or maybe been there for 2 years. And so we came out skiing to Aspen. Anyway, this tram, or I don't know what you call it, it was sort of on a cable. And it only had 2 stops, our house and the house above us. And I thought it was the most exciting and thrilling thing. So that's a very vivid memory of mine. Now, of course, that house, not only is it torn down, but their houses, they're just this year, 2006, developing a huge plex that's above the Fifth Avenue, that's way up on the hill. But at the time, it was the highest house. And the other vivid memory I have was that there were like 2 apartment buildings in town, and I think they each had 6 units. So all the physicists were in houses because there really weren't even any apartments. There were these funky little cabins, and accommodations varied. And I know that because I was social. My mom introduced us to other kids, and my dad, and we used to go places. So I did see the accommodations other people had. There were some kids of physicists our age that we were introduced to, and I don't remember everybody, but I do remember the Pines kids and the Couse kids. And we were all slightly different ages and into different things, but we basically all grew up here summers. And the other thing I remember was it was a really international environment. It was very American as well. There were a lot of people from many universities, but there were people coming from all over the place. And this was the summer camp for physicists, and it was a summer camp for the children. I mean, it was a fabulous summer camp. Even at the time, there were quite a few fewer things, enhancements in Aspen at the time, but there was still a ton of things we used to do. I used to go horseback riding at the Heather Bedlam, which no longer exists. It's out by the Aspen Highlands. And we used to ride in the meadows where there are now houses that have been built, but we used to gallop in those fields. Another thing I remember vividly, I have a brother who's just a year older than I am, and when we were up in the Anderman house, and even when we first, my parents bought a house here in '65, I think, and it's over on the west end, not far from Physics. And we didn't have TV at the time. At the time, there was no cable in Aspen, and the only television you got was from Grand Junction. One channel was very fuzzy with a lot of noise, and the other one you got fairly well. You couldn't get Denver stations even at the time because of all the mountains. And we did miss television. And we would go and sit behind. There was somebody who had a black and white TV who was at Louis Liquor Store, which was right in downtown Aspen. We were in the Anderman house, and we were little kids, but we were allowed to walk down there even at night. My parents would go out, and where we were at the time during the year, which was Evanston, Illinois, we were not allowed to be without a sitter. But we could go without sitters here. It was extremely safe at the time, and my parents had parameters, and they set for us, and we stuck to them. But my brother and I would go to the back screen door of this teeny little shack, which was Louis' liquor store, and the people there were really nice and let us watch TV standing out the back so we could get a TV fix occasionally. But, you know, that's a time gone by, really. And the thing that seems so crazy is, I mean, for some people watching, I will appear to be an older woman, and for others, I won't. But it wasn't that long ago, and Aspen has changed. It has been so transformed that it's hardly imaginable that there were days where you could only get, the other thing is when I got a little bit older and I was a teenager, couldn't get any rock radio in Aspen. So coming to Aspen in the summer meant doing without, except for at night, because it was so clear. We used to get some Kansas City station and listen to rock and roll out of Kansas City. I was coming here from the time I was about 8, I think, no, 8 or 10. And, you know, I changed a lot from that age through being a teenager, and I spent a lot of that time here in Aspen in the summers. As a teenager, I was thinking more for myself and had opinions. Prior to that, I just went wherever my family went. But my family traveled an enormous amount. And the one thing that made me feel very comfortable here was that most of the kids I met, their families were just like mine. And during the school year, their families were not. My family was a gypsy family, as was theirs. Before coming here, even at age 8 or so, we had lived abroad. For a year, I went to kindergarten in Italy. We had spent summers elsewhere, back in Italy another time. Afterwards, after our first summer here, my dad went to CERN to be on a sabbatical, I think, for the very first time to do an experiment. And this is maybe 64, 65. I went to 5th grade in Geneva, Switzerland. And so there were a lot of sort of gypsies like that. I met kids over the years who had either just been at CERN or were going to CERN, and we could talk about what that was like. Because, of course, our parents, either our father or mother, in most cases our father, was a physicist. And so their intellectual life and their professional life was all tied together with Aspen. For us, it was just where you went to follow your family. Another memory I have, I loved the Aspen physics picnics when I was really little. As a teenager, I was, of course, much more blasé. But as a little child, they were the best things. We used to go up to campgrounds. They were never on these grounds. In fact, there wasn't any lawn. It was all field and sagebrushes. Maybe there was a tiny little lawn, but it was one building, and there weren't the drainage ditches, and it wasn't landscaped the way it is today. I think that happened maybe in the 70s. I don't remember. But we always, weekly, would go up to some campground, and they would make the most magnificent fires, and people would try to roast steaks over the fire. I mean, there were plenty of mishaps, and it was always entertaining no matter what. And the kids, we all had marshmallows on sticks, and we would run around these campgrounds and be out, you know, among the pine trees and so forth. It was magnificent. I just remember it being a wonderful, wonderful thing. And when I first heard, I think I was in college or I was away when I first heard that the picnics had been moved to the grounds. And I was really upset to hear that. And it was in a very strange way. To me, it just seemed wrong. It was too civilized, and it seemed to take away from the spirit of early Aspen physics. But as my father reminded me months ago, we were talking about this, and he said when he first started coming to physics, there were maybe 20 to 30 physicists here or something, and today there are, he said something like 100? 90. So if you add all those families together, it just became impossible to get everybody up to some destination. And of course, just like every other physics picnic, I don't remember what day of the week it was, we had plenty of rain and rainouts. That's never changed. I have another time that I remember really well growing up and being a teenager here during the sort of hippie years of Aspen. And it was a time where Aspen was much more, I'd say, sociologically diverse, and it's certainly economically more diverse. I mean, even Aspen was economically more diverse. I don't know when that ended. Sometime in the 70s, but it was affordable for people. They weren't necessarily living in lovely conditions, but there would be plenty of ski bums and summer college dropouts and hippies and, living in yurts. I had a friend, my friend Sandy Slater, whose dad ran the Institute. Her sister was living up Hunter Creek in a yurt with her then boyfriend, Peter Hurst. They ended up getting married, had 2 kids, and then got divorced. He's now the president of the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado, believe it or not. I hadn't seen Sandy in a while. Sandy was out here last week with her mom. I took Sandy and her mom to a concert. Her mother is 88 years old. Joe died a few years ago. And her mom hadn't been in Aspen for a while. And actually, after he left, I don't know if it was after he left the Institute, but George Stranahan let them use some land. And they built kind of the equivalent of a trustee house, just a nothing house, down there and lived down valley. And my friend Sandy, the first time I ever went to a log cabin, I think I was 18 or 19 years old, and she was living in the winter in this log cabin in Woody Creek, had to chop her own wood. There was an outhouse, and I learned about chinking logs. I was basically raised in a city besides my outdoor Aspen experience, but I didn't know much about keeping a log cabin warm in winter. My children are Alex and Natalie. They're currently just about 20 and 17. Alex is at University of California, Santa Cruz, because we live in California. We live in Malibu, California. We've been out in the LA area since '80, or no, I have. My children were born there. And Natalie will be a senior in high school. So next year will be a big year for her. And my kids have been coming to Aspen since birth, about 4 months after birth. In fact, through my mom and dad's physics connections, they were able to borrow baby things, just ask friends to borrow baby things, because we would come periodically, but nobody wanted to re-equip their homes for all the baby stuff that you need, and it was sort of hard to bring it all out for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. So, but my kids have grown up here, and even I was I work in the entertainment business and an entertainment publicist, and for many years I didn't have a lot of time off. But my mom and dad graciously, in fact, they wanted to see their grandkids more. These are their only grandchildren. And so I would come out with them often in the summer and leave them here, or one or the other, and then they would stay out here an extra couple of weeks, and one of my parents would take them home. This is when they were too small to travel alone. And likewise in the winter, I don't think I've mentioned that my whole family are skiers. And one of the attractions of Aspen wasn't strictly the summer, but the winter. And we would come here almost annually after my parents bought their home, with the exception of years when my dad was working in Europe, which was quite a few years actually in a row. At one point in the 70s, he wasn't here much. He wasn't in the States much. He was I think at Northwestern 2 quarters a year, in Geneva the rest of the time. In any event, I've skied my entire life. I actually learned abroad when my dad was on a fellowship in Italy. And we skied the years we were in Switzerland, and we always would come to Aspen, and so they would rent their house. The only way they could afford the house was to rent it pretty much year-round. And they would have a proviso that the tenants move out for 2 weeks at Christmas so our family could come and ski. And then in those years that we were doing Aspen Physics, they would also have tenants move out for a period in the summer, up to 3 months. Both my children learned to ski here. My son now is a devout snowboarder, and I don't know if I'll ever see him back on 2 boards again. But when he was starting in kindergarten in the public schools in LA, they went to something called year-round, and they completely changed the schedule. However, he was at an elementary school that wasn't really year-round, but they had to stick somewhat to the schedule. So he started in the middle of August and had 4 weeks in the winter off. So again, I would come up when I could for a week or 10 days, because often, the other thing is that I work in film, and you're always doing Oscar campaigns around the holidays, and it was always tricky to take time off when the years that I had a contender or anything close to a contender. But I'd come up here because right afterwards are the Golden Globes and all these things that affect my life and have no effect on physicists. But I would manage to get up here and bring Alex, and my mom and dad, who had learned how to be certified ski instructors, took him, and he would stay out here an entire month. And so he was out here for a month when he was 5, 6, and 7, I think, and it turned him into a fabulous skier. My daughter less so, and my father can appear to be very big in a room and grouchy sometimes to a little girl. And they have similar personalities in a way, but he intimidated her. And so when he would teach her how to ski, she was much more cautious and less comfortable. So she never became the skier that Alex is, and she doesn't have the passion for it that he does. But because of Aspen Physics, you know, we ended up with a house here. My parents couldn't afford a house here in a million years. It's so amazing how many physicists are within blocks. You know, only the physicists who are older and who got out here early, but they own homes in an area where virtually each of those homes would be a tear down today. You know, people would get their hands on that property because it's considered prime west end of Aspen property, and they would raise whatever's there and build something to as far out on the site as they could. But one thing that I thought was pretty interesting is Alex this year is working at the center, and he has a lot of interest in math and science, but he's studying, his degree is going to be in economics, I think. But he's not really a scientist, but he's quite curious. And one of the jobs he has is to run the AV equipment. And he told me that he's in charge of running 2 days a week movies or DVDs over at the hall. And I said to him, well, you know, what do you think of that? And he said that he wasn't really, you know, all that excited about his job. It was a bit boring, but what he was excited to do is to see how much he could understand. That he actually was, felt challenged by the information that was going to run before him, and that he was going to pay attention and see what he could learn. And that made me feel really, really proud.
How would you characterize what your dad does?
Oh, I'm not capable of characterizing what he does because I don't really understand what he does. I've never been that great at math. I was never that interested in science. I always considered myself, in a funny way, the black sheep, because I went in the entertainment business. My brother's a professor, my dad's a professor. My mother had done biology and worked in a lab years ago, and I was the only member of the family that didn't really have a grasp. And I don't have a fascination either. I do have an interest and a curiosity, but it only gets me so far because I get lost in some of the more mathematical areas. But I do understand how people can get passionate about it, which I think has to do with growing up in that kind of family. And I think that there are other families that have not a clue as to what it's all about, but that's as close as I can get. So I can't really characterize what my father does. I know, you know, he tells me what he does, and he sits down and tells me about papers he's working on, and he's pretty good at explaining it to a lay person, but it still doesn't really stick. I mean, he's worked on elementary particle physics. He did a lot of experimental physics. That's why he was at CERN. He's done a lot of theory, and what I'm really proud about is he's 80 years old, and he just published this huge paper, statistical paper, and that's gotten published, and he was pretty happy to be 80 years old and still be published. I'm just very glad for him that he gets to use his mind and that he can appear to be as intently wrapped up in it and excited about his work. And I think that that's just a blessing. Very few people get to do that, and I think that science in general is one of the areas where people can, as long as they can breathe and think. I don't think it really was a hardship on my mother to pick up and come here, to come and go, as much as it was on some other families, some other mothers of families, because we had a smaller family, we had 2 children. It wasn't like there were 5 or 6 kids to try to organize. Also, my mom and dad had started a pattern of travel. Even before Aspen. I mean, I think since the beginning of their marriage, since my dad was a grad student, and I think my mother was both challenged but very supportive of it, and she loved Aspen. And she didn't like Geneva that much. I mean, I think she loved the benefits of being in Geneva, but the little apartments you'd be in Meyrin could be very isolating. You know, Meyrin, which was near the CERN headquarters, was actually some distance from Geneva, and if you didn't have a car, if, you know, my dad needed the car and she had to go in on the bus, it wasn't as much fun actually, but Aspen, you could always walk places and do things, and my mother loves a lot of different outdoor activities, so I don't think so. On the other hand, I think that sort of, as far as she was concerned, was part of her territory, to have to do a million change of address cards and pack people up and keep organized, and it also happened to coincide with her nature. My mom is very well organized. One thing that I do recall from my teenage years was when the NAL was being planned, and there were a lot of physicists out here from all over the country and again internationally who were doing that, and they tended to have kids my age, and it was really a lot of fun. And at one point, and this was sort of very much during the hippie era, and right, you know, when they were having happenings when Klaus Oldenburg and Robert Rauschenberg were in town, and I happened to meet like the nanny of one of theirs who was just a few years older than me, and there was just this amazing collection of people that all got to know each other. Anyway, my mom and dad set up a tent in our backyard, and we used to have people sleeping there. I remember the Wasserman kids, and I remember the Wilson kids, and who else? Somebody from Harvard. Anyway, it was a lot of fun, and there was a lot of partying at the teenage level going on. And it was sort of a safe place, and we were given a lot of freedom to go around town and do our own things. And there was certainly, every time you walked into town, there was something going on. It was all happening. And it really, I think, opened all our eyes in ways that we might not have been in our own, you know, hometowns.